We're going to be talking today about how to use Sass and Compass for your next front-end web development project. And I'll be using some examples from Drupal because I assume that a lot of you are using Drupal, but the skills that you're going to learn are really cross-platforms, so it doesn't really matter what type of project that you're doing. You could be using WordPress or just a plain HTML site. Sass and Compass are tools that you can use whenever you're using CSS. So just to give you a bit of background information about me, my name is Suzanne Dergachova, and I work at Evolving Web. We're a Drupal consulting and development company, and we also run a training program. So we teach a lot about Drupal and other web development topics. You can find out more at evolvingweb.ca/training. And just to let you know, we have a couple sessions coming up, one in Montreal on September 12th, and a Drupal theming training in Ottawa later on in September. So if you are a front-end developer and you're getting into Drupal, this is going to be a really useful session for you. And if you're interested in trainings on other topics, you can find out more on our website or get in touch with us, and we're always looking to add more trainings to the schedule. So just to get started with the topic of today's presentation, Sass and Compass, what are these tools and what are they for? Why would you want to use them? You've probably heard of Sass and Compass, but just to give you an overview or a reminder, Sass is a tool that gives you a better syntax for writing CSS, a more advanced syntax. It's a bit more complicated, but it's going to give you a lot more features and more flexibility. It'll eventually help you to write CSS probably more quickly, more efficiently, and also to be able to maintain it and extend it more efficiently. So some of the examples of features are nesting, so being able to nest selectors inside of each other, the ability to have variables or be able to store certain bits of information like colors and sizes and things that you're reusing again and again in your CSS. You have functions, so there's some functions built in that let you, for example, manipulate color. And you also have mixins, which are blocks of CSS that you might want to reuse for different parts of your CSS. So how Sass works is that you're writing a new type of file instead of a CSS file. You're creating an SCSS file, and these get transformed into CSS files. So you have a new file type with a bunch of new features, but the way that your CSS is included in your project is still the same because it's going to get transformed into CSS before it's actually loaded on the page. So that's Sass. You also have another tool called Compass, which goes alongside of Sass. So Compass is a tool for converting Sass files into regular CSS, and it also provides some additional features along the way that are going to make your life easier. So when you first use Sass and Compass, you're probably just going to use Compass to do the transformation. But as you get more familiar with it, there's some additional features that it's going to add as well that I'll talk about later on in the presentation. So I did mention that when you're using Sass, you're going to be converting your SCSS files to your CSS files. And usually how this is going to be organized in your project is that you're going to have a new folder in your project called Sass. You could call it anything, but conventionally, to keep it organized, it's a good idea to call it Sass. And this is going to go alongside any other folders that you would normally have in your theme or in the files that define the front end of your site. So typically you're going to have a folder to keep all of your images that are used, your JavaScript files, your CSS files, and this is just going to be a new folder that lives alongside of those. So normally I have a folder called CSS, and that has a bunch of CSS files in it. I'm also now going to have one called Sass that has all of my SCSS files. And the SCSS files, it looks something like what's on the left of this slide here in pink. So you have some extra features. It's going to look a little bit different than what you're used to. And this is going to be transformed into a CSS file that's going to look very familiar. And it's going to be generated, but there's going to be lots of comments in there to help you figure out what's going on. So you're going to have access to both of these folders as you're working on your project. So the Sass syntax is something that you'll have to learn and get used to in order to start using it. But the nice thing about Sass is that you don't have to learn everything right away. You can start off by just learning a few new features, and if you just include the CSS that you would normally include in your project, this is going to get picked up and used just as normal. So you don't have to learn everything all at once. You can learn it bit by bit as you feel comfortable. So the first feature of Sass that I think is really useful that you'll probably start using right away is nesting. And nesting works by adding selectors, blocks of CSS, within other blocks of CSS. So in this example, we have a title, an H2 heading, that's inside of a block in our HTML. So there's a div with a class of block on it, and inside of that we have an H2 title. And normally if I was going to add some styling to both of these elements, I'd have to create two separate selectors in my style sheet, one for the block and one for the heading. And that's what you see on the right. But on the left is this same bit of code, but written with the Sass syntax. And here you see that we can actually nest the heading inside of the div, inside of the block. And so this just helps you kind of see the hierarchy of your HTML inside of your CSS. And it also is going to cut down on how many selectors you have to keep track of, because you might have a heading inside of your block, but you might also have a list that you can include right underneath. And then you don't have to repeat the selector again and again. So you have the actual nesting appear as nesting in your code rather than just have selectors that get longer and longer as they get more specific. So on the left you have the Sass syntax, and this is the file that you're going to be editing and writing. And you'll see there's the extension SCSS, and this is going to get converted into what you see on the right, the CSS file that you're used to. So one example where this nesting feature is really useful is if you're given a bunch of CSS to integrate into your project. So this bit of CSS that you see here is a screenshot from a CSS snippet that's up on GitHub, and it's used to style Markdown. And it's something that I got given for a project I'm working on, and it's CSS that's supposed to just be applied to one type of content on my site. So I only want this to apply to that content type. I don't want this to apply to every single page on the site. So I need to make all of these selectors here more specific. And normally if I was going to get this file, I'd have to prepend the class for that content type to every single selector. But if I'm using Sass, I can just add the selector around the entire block of code. So I can just add one level of nesting and it's going to work right off the bat without me having to edit, 100 lines in this file. So it's going to save me a lot of time, and it's also just going to be a lot quicker to update if I ever want to change that, or if I ever want to add a second content type that this applies to. It just becomes much easier to manage. Another example of something that you can do with nesting is you can refer to the outer selector in an inner selector. So for example, if you're styling a bunch of links on your site and you want to highlight the hover state somehow and add a selector for that, rather than defining two separate selectors like I'm doing on the right here in the CSS file, one for the link itself and one for the hover state, I can just have a single selector with a nested selector for the hover state. So it's really clear that these two styles are linked, and they're applying to the same type of element. One of them is just the hover state of the element. So the ampersand is just referring to the selector one level up from the hover state. Another feature that you're probably going to want to use right away with Sass is using variables. And variables are something that you're probably familiar with if you've ever written any PHP or any other programming language. Variables are just a way to store information. So if you haven't done any programming before, this might seem a little bit, a little bit confusing, but basically it's just a way to track a piece of information that you want to use over and over again. And you're tracking it and you're also giving it a name, which is nice because it makes it easier to read and figure out what's going on. So what I'm doing here on the left is I'm defining this color. I'm calling it a highlight color, and it's red, and it's just a hex code. So I'm defining it, and then I can use it throughout the CSS that I'm writing. So I define highlight color, and then I'm using it right away as the color for the H1, H2, and H3 elements on the site. And then on the right, you see how this gets transformed into CSS. The color gets applied to those elements. So in this example, I'm only using highlight color once, so it doesn't seem all that useful, but you can see that if you used it again and again, maybe for border colors, maybe as a background color, then it's going to be a lot easier if I ever decide to change what the highlight color is for this theme. And this can also be useful if you have, let's say, a more dynamic website where you want someone to be able to come along and change the color through the configuration. If you just have one place where you're defining this color in your code, in your CSS, then it'll be a lot easier to change that programmatically. So here's an example where I'm using the highlight color a couple more times, so I can use this as many times as I need to. And in this example, all of the places where highlight color is used, it's in the same file, so I just have one file. But there's also a really simple way of importing this variable into all of your CSS files. And so if you have a color that you're using throughout your theme, you can just define it once and then use it throughout the files. So I'll show you that a little bit later. Another built-in function or another built-in feature that you might want to use are Sass functions. And these are used primarily to manipulate colors. So again, if you have some colors that you're defining in your theme, but you want to have some variations on them to lighten them, darken them, change the hue or the saturation, you can do that with these built-in functions. So I have two examples here. To use these functions, it's just like using a function in PHP or some other programming language. So you have the name of the function, darken or lighten, and then you're using the original color, highlight color, as the first argument that you're passing in. So you're telling darken, okay, take this highlight color. And then the 20 there, the second argument, that's telling the darken function to darken this color by 20%. And then similarly with the lighten function, you pass it the color that you want to change, and then you're telling the function to lighten this color by 20%. So rather than hard coding a whole bunch of different colors in your theme, you can just have one color and then manipulate that using these functions. And that's going to make it even easier if you ever wanted to change the color in your theme. You just have one place to change it, and everywhere else it's getting used, it would just automatically be updated. And so you can see on the right that this function is transformed into an actual hex code that you would normally see in CSS. So if you want to see exactly what color this is being turned into, you could just open up the CSS file to see what's going on. And this will be the file on the right, that's actually loaded along with your HTML by the browser. So the last feature that's really useful that, again, you're going to use right off the bat is the concept of mixins. So mixins are chunks of CSS that you want to reuse. So let's say I have 5 lines of CSS that I use for every button on my site. Every time I define a button for a form, for a search interface, for a sign-up button, I'm always using the same few lines of CSS. So I'm sure if you're writing a lot of CSS, you've done this before. It might be 5 lines, it might just be 2 lines, but if you're repeating yourself all the time in your CSS, it can become kind of inefficient. If you ever decide to change how buttons are styled, it's a lot of work to go back and fix it everywhere. So with a mixin, you're defining the styling once, and then you can use it as many times as you want to. So this mixin that we're creating is called button. It's just a name that I'm coming up with. You can choose whatever name you want. And then you're defining the CSS that you want to apply to the button elements. And then to use this, you use the word @include and then the name of the mixin, so button. So @mixin is used when you're defining the mixin, and @include is used when you're applying it to an element. And you can see on the right that this is turned into a block of CSS that's applied to the element that I included the mixin for. So in this case, it's just one element, it's just a submit button, but I could apply this to a whole bunch of different elements throughout my CSS. So mixins are useful, just the static mixin that you see here, this can be really useful for you right off the bat, but you might feel that you need something a bit more advanced. Maybe you want to apply the same styling to a bunch of elements, but you have some slight variations. So maybe you have some border styling that you want to add to paragraphs and headings and buttons and different elements on your site, but you want the color to be slightly different and maybe you want the width to be slightly different. So you can define a mixin that takes arguments. So for example, this mixin is called fancy border, and it takes a color argument and a width argument. So you can have a different color and width depending on how this mixin is used. So when you're defining the mixin, when you're actually writing out the CSS, you just need to include the 2 arguments like you see here. So it's the same kind of syntax like you see with the variables where you have a $sign at the beginning. And then you can see in the CSS where it gets defined in the border property and the, just the border property, you have the 2 variables in there. So instead of hard coding the width and the color, you're just using the variables width and color. And then those get passed from the @include. So further down where you see the paragraph and the heading, where we're including the fancy border for these elements, instead of just calling fancy border, we're also defining the color, blue, and the width, 5 pixels. And then for the heading 1, it's slightly different. It's a red border that's just 1 pixel wide. And so you can see how this gets transformed into CSS, where you actually have you actually have the full CSS written out. So this is a way of making your CSS more efficient, but still including a lot of flexibility. So the last sort of feature of Sass that I'll talk about is extend. And extend is kind of similar to mixins because you have a block of CSS that you're reusing. But instead of defining it up front, the block of CSS, you're just reusing the CSS that you've already applied to another element. So in this example, we have two blocks. We have block 1 and block 2. These selectors come from what you see in Drupal with the built-in block system. And basically what's happening is you're defining a border and a padding for block 1. And then when you define the styling for block 2, you're just pulling in the styling that you defined for block 1 and adding an extra property, the background color. So on the right, you can see that block 1 and block 2 are sharing the same properties for border and padding. And then block 2 has an additional background color defined for it. So again, it's a way of making your CSS more efficient and reusing. And it's just a little bit different from mixins because you're not defining the CSS up front. And in this case, you don't have the ability to add in arguments. So it's a little bit less flexible. So what you'll see with all of these features, with the variables and the mixins and extend, is that your CSS is going to become more interdependent. So you're defining variables and then you're using them in other parts of your CSS. And the issue that you're going to run into is that you don't want to be redefining your variables and your mixins at the top of each SCSS file that you write. So what you'll typically do is have a file where you define a whole bunch of defaults. So all of these variables and these mixins will be defined there. And then in your other files, you'll just import the defaults. So you see here that I have on the left two SCSS files that I'm listing, a defaults.scss and a styles.scss. And the defaults.scss actually starts with an underscore. And that's just a convention that means that this file, it's not going to be explicitly included in my project. It's just going to be imported into other SCSS files. So it's kind of like a partial if you're used to, other projects call these partials. They're just files that are meant to be included in other files. And so in our styles.scss, you can see that the first line is @import defaults. So just like in normal CSS, you can import another file, but you don't even have to include the underscore or the .scss. It's going to know that if you write it that way, it's just going to import everything from that defaults file. And then further down in your SCSS file, you can use the variables and the mixins that were defined in the defaults file. So I really recommend setting up your project like this, especially if in the past you've used multiple CSS files and you want to keep doing that and keep structuring your files the same way. This is going to let you do that, and you'll just have this extra file for the defaults to set up the variables and the mixins. So those are the features that I'm going to cover today in terms of the Sass syntax. There's reference material, you can go online and find out more. But just one thing I wanted to clarify before I move on to talk about Compass is that what I've been talking about, it's what you're going to use if you're writing an SCSS file. So you're using the Sass syntax, but there's actually two types of files that you could write. There's SCSS files and Sass files. So it's two different extensions, and they're similar, but with the SCSS files, it's the same syntax that you've always used with CSS, with these added features. With the .sass files, the .sass files, it's a very different syntax, and it's based on indentation. So if you just start writing CSS as you normally would, it's not going to work with those files. And so I recommend using SCSS files and just going with that route. I think that's the method that most people have adopted. But if you're looking for documentation online, you might see a reference to a .sass file, and I just wanted to explain what that is. Both of them work with Compass, but I think CSS is just easier to use. And you can find out more if you just Google SASS versus SCSS, you'll find information about that. So once you've learned how to write some of the Sass syntax and start using that, the first thing you'll really want to do is set up Compass and start converting your SCSS files to CSS. And there's two ways that you can do this. So there's two ways that you can use Compass. You can either use a GUI tool or you can use the command line. So Compass is based on Ruby, so there's some setup that you have to do. You have to make sure that Ruby's installed, and so that's a bit of overhead that you might not want to do. So if you're using a GUI tool, that's going to set up everything for you. It's just going to be a point and click kind of tool. And there's two that I have listed here. I think there's probably other ones out there. Scout and Compass app. And I'm going to do a demo using this tool, and I'm going to use Scout. But either one works. And then for the command line, if you're comfortable using the command line, there's really just a couple commands to learn to start using Compass. So if you just install, have Ruby installed, you install Compass, you install Sass, there's just a couple lines. So if you're comfortable using the command line, I would go with that route. That's what I usually use for my projects. So I'm going to do the demo with Scout, and the first step is to create the theme folder, and then to create your Sass and CSS folders inside of the theme. And here I'm doing this example on a Drupal site, but again, you could do this wherever your theme is living, whatever type of platform you're using, or if you're just using plain vanilla HTML, it's going to be exactly the same thing. So in this case, the folder My Theme, that's where I normally keep, all the files that define the look and feel of the site. So the CSS and the JavaScript and the images and all of that. So I'm going to create that folder. I'm going to add the Sass and CSS folders to it. And then I'm going to set up Scout to start converting the Sass files to the CSS files. So I'm going to go over to where my site is living. I have Drupal set up here, and I'm just going to do make dir sites all themes, my theme, and then I'll call my theme Sassy Theme. Oops. It's all themes, sorry. Sites all themes custom Sassy theme. So I have my theme file folder here, and I'm going to set up two folders inside of it. One called CSS, so this is what you would normally have for your CSS files, and one called Sass, and this is where I'm going to add the SCSS files. So I'll start off by adding just one file to this called styles.scss. And in here, I can define a variable. So right away, I can start using the syntax that we've learned. I can say that red is this hex code here. And I can decide to use that for all the text on the site. So I'm just going to say body color is red, just to make sure that this is all working. And then what I have to do is open up Scout. So Scout is this tool for running Compass. And if you're using Scout, all you have to do is tell Scout where your Sass files are and where you want to put the CSS files. So it's going to do the conversion for you. You just have to point to those folders that you just set up. So I'm going to use this plus icon here to add the project. I'll go to the place where the folders are, sites, all, themes, custom, Sassy theme. And then I'm going to choose the input folder. So the input folder is my Sass folder. And then the output folder is my CSS folder. So that's empty right now. Scout's going to fill that up for me. And then I just have to click play. And if you're using the command line, the equivalent of clicking play is using the command compass watch and then giving it the path to the folder where your theme is. And even though this is a GUI tool and it's hiding things from you, what's going to show up on the right is basically the command line output for writing Compass Watch. So it looks a little bit like a command line tool, but you don't have to do anything. You don't have to type anything there. It's just watching that folder where your Sass lives and turning that into CSS. So back over here where my file is, this is my SCSS file, and I can open up the CSS folder, and now there is an equivalent CSS file that's been generated for me, and you can see that it has the CSS that I would expect. So in the first folder, or in the first file, I have my SCSS using the Sass syntax, and in this file that's been generated, I have the equivalent CSS. So I can kind of see what's going on there. And this is going to change as soon as I change what's in the SCSS file. So just to make sure that this is working in terms of my Drupal site, if I go over to my Drupal site here, I can go and turn on this theme that I just made. I'll have to make an info file, because this is a Drupal site. So I'll go to sites, all, themes, custom, Sassy theme, and then I'll just make a file called sassytheme.info, and it's just going to have the name, the description, the version of Drupal, and the engine is PHP template. So now I should be able to go ahead and turn this on. Sassy theme, enable and set default. So you're going to do whatever the equivalent is on the platform you're using. And then I'll just go to the home page of the site to check this out. So when I'm telling this theme what CSS to use, I'm not going to even mention that I'm using Sass. Drupal doesn't care about Sass. It just knows about CSS files. So that's what I'm going to reference here in the info file. And you know, if you're just including this directly in an HTML file, you'll do it just as you normally would with a reference to the CSS file. So here we have styles.css. This is the file that Scout created for us. This is the one we're going to reference. So I'll go back here and check it out, and now all the font is red because that's the styling that I added. So I'll just add one more kind of feature here so we can see what's going on. Inside of the body, I'll add a second selector for the heading tags, and I'll just add I'll add a text transform. So you can see that this is going to select all of the H1, H2, and H3 tags inside the body. And sure enough, that's going to make all of my headings in uppercase. So we have nesting, we have variables, and you can experiment with using the other features that we saw. So, defining a mixin would be like this. So I can define a mixin called heading. I can make it uppercase like we're doing already for the H1, H2, H3s. And then down here, instead of hard coding this styling, instead I'm just going to say add include mixin, add include heading. So I'm going to use my heading mixin for the heading tags. So that'll change the styling of the heading tags. And then you could use this same mixin throughout your files. If you have a separate CSS file to define your forms and you want to use a heading styling in there somewhere, then you can do that. You just have to use that @import syntax. So normally I would add these two top sections here, lines 1 to 6. I'd put that into a defaults.scss and then just import that into all my other CSS files. And then back over in your theme where you're actually referencing the CSS files, you just want to be referencing all the CSS files that are generated by your SCSS, with the exception of anything that's just defining defaults that you're importing into other files. So I'm not going to go too much further into this demo because could spend hours just showing you all these different features. So this is something that you can set up for yourself and start playing around with. And the really nice thing about learning Sass is that you don't have to learn it all at once, like I mentioned. In your SCSS file, you can just include CSS as you normally would. So if you already have a site set up and you've already written CSS for it, you don't have to go and convert everything over to a new syntax. You can just include it in this file like you normally would. So you can copy your CSS and put it into your SCSS file, and then you can modify it so that it's using some of these features. So just going back to my slides over here. So setting up a project with Scout is pretty straightforward, like you see. If you want to use the command line, there's not too many steps. So if you're comfortable using it, I would highly recommend that. You do have to install Sass and Compass. So if you have Ruby already set up, you just have to run gem install Sass, gem install Compass, and then there's one line to create a project. And then there's one line to set up Compass to watch your project. And watching just means it's going to look at what you put into the Sass folder and convert it into CSS. So Compass Watch is just watching over your project for you. And just one note here on the line that says Compass create, and then it's the path to the project that you want to create. That should be a double hyphen bear. That just means don't add any extra folders, only add one for the Sass and one for the CSS. And then the next little argument that you're passing, that should be hyphen CSS dir equals CSS. That just means set up a folder called CSS for my CSS files. If you don't put that, it's going to create a folder called style sheets. So the default is style sheets. I like calling it CSS, but you can do it however you want. So this is the command line version of what I just showed you with Scout. If you have an existing theme, if you have an existing project and you want to start using Sass and Compass, it's not a lot of work to set it up. You just will want to create this new Sass folder in your theme and copy your CSS files into there, or actually you want to move them. You have to change the extension to SCSS. And then if you're using the command line, you'll just use Compass create, put the path to your theme, and then you can use bear and the CSS dir like I just showed you. And then you want to just run Compass watch and then the path to your theme. If you're using Scout, you don't have to do those last two steps. You'll just add the folder as one of your projects and click the play button and it's going to work. So very few steps. It's just copying your CSS files into this new folder, and then keep in mind that anything in your CSS files is going to get overridden by Compass. So Compass is this tool for converting Sass to CSS, but it also does a whole bunch of other things if you want it to. It comes with a bunch of libraries that you can import into your files and start using. And so these libraries include variables and mixins that you can take advantage of. And one example of this that I think is useful for everyone right off the bat is a library that gives you a bunch of mixins and variables around CSS3. So if you've ever written CSS3, you know it's for adding things like rounded corners to your boxes, and you can use it for all kinds of things. But usually you'll have to include these, you'll have to include more than one property, because there's a different version for WebKit and a different version for Mozilla, and so there's these different versions of the properties that you have to include. And so if you're using Compass, instead of writing everything out 3 times, you'll just have to write it out once using a mixin. So for example, for a box shadow, normally you'd have to do something like Moz box shadow, WebKit box shadow, and then box shadow as the default, like you see here in this example. And that's just to define a drop shadow on your the block that you're creating. Whereas if you have Compass installed, you can import the Compass CSS3 library, just using @import compass/CSS3, and then all you have to do is use the mixin single box shadow that Compass provides. So it's just like when you're using the mixins that you've created. You use @include, you use the name of the mixin, and then there's some arguments that you're passing. But with this example, it's a mixin that Compass is defining. So there's all kinds of mixins like this that you can start using with Compass, and they're all documented at compass-style.org/reference. So there's a reference there of all the different mixins and variables that you can use. And so it's going to save you a lot of time. And again, it's something that you don't have to start using on day 1 that you learn Compass. It's something that you can start doing as you write a new theme or add some features to your theme, or you decide you want to refactor your theme. So you can start integrating these elements into your Sass. So using Sass and Compass with Drupal, I already showed you how to create a custom theme that's based on Sass and Compass. And there are lots of themes out there for Drupal that already use Sass and come with Sass files. And a lot of these are base themes. So for example, Zen, Omega, these are base themes that you've probably heard of, or they're maybe ones that you're using. And these all include those components. So if you set up a sub-theme for one of those themes, it's automatically going to be assuming that you're using Sass. And so there'll already be a project set up, and all you'll have to do is use Compass Watch or set up Scout to watch your sub-theme. You'll probably want to look at the theme files more carefully to see exactly what's going on. So, for example, if you set up a sub-theme with Zen, there's a bunch of Compass libraries that are imported for you, as well as a library that's created by Zen called Zen Grids. So if you go and open the base.scss file in your Zen subtheme, then you'll see a whole bunch of partials that are imported. And so it's a good idea to review how your theme is using Sass and Compass, and to sort of see how the files are organized so that you are able to use the theme more efficiently and just take advantage of what's already being added for you. And I really recommend trying out Zen Grids. I have a separate presentation on it that's online somewhere. If you Google Zen Grids, you'll find out lots more about it. It's basically a grid system that's based on Sass. So if you want to set up a different number of columns or different gutters between your columns, you can just set those up as variables. And all you have to do is change one variable, and it changes your whole grid system. So it's really powerful. And once you start to learn Sass and Compass, it's going to be easy to learn. So there's lots of resources out there online, because I only just kind of scratched the surface today. You're going to have to, look things up as you try to do things with Sass. A couple things I recommend looking at. There's reference guides online for Sass and for Compass. There's a really great article on GitHub for best practices for using Sass. GitHub.com/AnthonyShort/idiomatic-Sass. And that just has some best practices around how to write Sass that's efficient. So how to use extends versus mixins, and the ordering and just the organization. And if you're really into writing code that's semantic and makes sense and is efficient, then it's a really great article to read. There's a bunch of really great blog posts about Sass at thesassway.com. So if you want to learn about the built-in functions, or about how to do different tips and tricks like replacing a text with like an icon, then there's lots of blog posts up there. And then there's also links here to Scout, the Scout app for converting Sass to CSS using Compass, and also compass.app, which is the other GUI tool that you might want to use. So I hope this was a useful session on Sass and Compass, a good introduction. I hope you're able to now go and take this and start using Sass right away. We have some upcoming trainings if you want to learn more about Drupal, and we do have theming trainings, and there's a responsive Drupal training that we offer sometimes. So if you want to know more, check out evolvingweb.ca/training, and please do request a training if you would like to learn more about a particular topic. So thanks so much for joining us today, and hopefully see you again at a future presentation.